P. Paranoia. Paranoia is a form of psychosis characterized principally by delusions. Freud's experience of treating paranoiacs was limited, and his most extensive work on the subject is not the record of a course of treatment, but the analysis of the written memoirs of a paranoid man, a judge by the name of Daniel Paul Schreber. It is in this work that Freud puts forward his theory that paranoia is a defense against homosexuality, arguing that the different forms of paranoid delusion are based on different ways of negating the phrase, I, a man, love him. Lacan's interest in paranoia predates his interest in psychoanalysis. It is the subject of his first major work, his doctoral dissertation. In this work, Lacan discusses a psychotic woman whom he calls Aimée, whom he diagnoses as suffering from self-punishment paranoia, paranoia d'autopunition, a new clinical category proposed by Lacan himself. Lacan returns to the subject of paranoia in his seminar of 1955-56, which he devotes to a sustained commentary on the Schreber case. Lacan finds Freud's theory about the homosexual roots of paranoia inadequate, and proposes instead his own theory of foreclosure as the specific mechanism of psychosis. Like all clinical structures, paranoia reveals in a particularly vivid way certain basic features of the psyche. The ego has a paranoid structure because it is the site of a paranoid alienation. Knowledge, connaissance, itself is paranoid. The process of psychoanalytic treatment induces controlled paranoia into the human subject. Part object. Objet partiel. According to Melanie Klein, the infant's underdeveloped capacity for perception, together with the fact that he is only concerned with his immediate gratifications, means that the subject begins by relating only to a part of a person rather than the whole. The primordial part object is, according to Klein, the mother's breast. As the child's visual apparatus develops, so also does his capacity to perceive people as whole objects rather than collections of separate parts. See Hinchelwood. While the term part object was first introduced by the Lacanian school of psychoanalysis, the origins of the concept can be traced back to Karl Abrahams's work and ultimately to Freud. For example, when Freud states that partial drives are directed towards objects such as the breast or feces, these are clearly part objects. Freud also implies that the penis is a part object in his discussion of the castration complex, in which the penis is imagined as a separable organ, and in his discussion of fetishism, see Laplanche and Pontalis. The concept of the part object plays an important part in Lacan's work from early on. Lacan finds the concept of the part object particularly useful in his criticism of object relations theory, which he attacks for attributing a false sense of completeness to the object. In opposition to this tendency, Lacan argues that just as all drives are partial drives, so all objects are necessarily partial objects. Lacan's focus on the part object is clear evidence of the important Kleinian influences in his work. However, whereas Klein defines these objects as partial because they are only part of a whole object, Lacan takes a different view. They are partial, he argues, not because these objects are part of a total object, the body, but because they represent only partially the function that produces them. In other words, in the unconscious, only the pleasure-giving function of these objects is represented, while their biological function is not represented. Furthermore, Lacan argues that what isolates certain parts of the body as a part object is not any biological given, but a signifying system of language. In addition to the partial objects already discovered by psychoanalytic theory before Lacan, the breast, the feces, the phallus as imaginary object, and the urinary flow, Lacan adds in 1960 several more: the phoneme, the gaze, the voice, and the nothing. These objects all have one feature in common: they have no specular image. In other words, they are precisely that which cannot be assimilated into the subject's narcissistic illusion of completeness. Lacan's conceptualization of the part object is modified with the development around 1963-64 of the concept of objectivité as the cause of desire. Now each partial object becomes an object by virtue of the fact that the subject takes it for the object of desire, objectivité. From this point on in his work, Lacan usually restricts his discussion of part objects to only four: the voice, the gaze, the breast, and feces. Pass. In 1967, 3 years after founding his School of Psychoanalysis, the École Freudienne de Paris, or EFP, Lacan instituted a new kind of procedure in the school, Lacan. The procedure was called the Pass and was essentially an institutional framework designed to allow people to testify to the end of their analysis. The main idea behind this was Lacan's argument that the end of analysis is not a quasi-mystical, ineffable experience, but must be in accordance with the basic principle of psychoanalysis articulated in language. The procedure was as follows. The person seeking the pass, le passant, tells two witnesses, les passeurs, who must be in analysis at the time about his own analysis and its conclusion, and these two witnesses then relay this account separately to a jury of 7, some of whom have successfully been through the pass themselves. The jury then decides on the basis of the two accounts whether to award the pass to the candidate. There were no pre-established criteria to guide the jury, since the pass was based on the principle that each person's analysis is unique. If the candidate was successful, he accorded the title of AI, Analyste de l'École. AE. Unsuccessful candidates were not to be prevented from seeking the pass again if they wished to do so. The pass was designed to be the means by which a person might seek recognition by the school of the end of his analysis. The pass was not an obligatory process. Whether or not an analyst decided to seek it was entirely up to him. It was not a qualification to practice analysis, since the authorization of an analyst can only come from himself. Lacan, see training. Nor was it a recognition by the school of the member's status as an analyst. This recognition was granted by another, wholly independent means in Lacan's school and corresponded to the title of AME, Analyste Membre de l'École. It was solely the recognition that a person's analysis had reached its logical conclusion, and that this person could extract an articulated knowledge, savoir, from this experience. The pass thus concerns not a clinical function, but a teaching function. It is supposed to testify to the capacity of the passant to theorize his own experience of psychoanalytic treatment, and thereby to contribute to psychoanalytic knowledge. Jacques-Alain Miller comments that it is important to distinguish between 1. The pass as an institutional procedure as described above, and 2. The pass as the personal experience of the end of one's analysis, the passage from being an analysant to being an analyst, which may be testified to by the pass in the first sense of the term. Miller. 1977. In the 1970s, the institution of the pass became the focus of an intense controversy within the EFP. While some supported Lacan's own views that the pass would yield important contributions to knowledge of the end of analysis, others criticized it for being divisive and unworkable. These debates became even more heated in the final years of the EFP before Lacan dissolved his school in 1980. Of the various Lacanian organizations which exist today, some have abandoned Lacan's proposal, while many others retain the institution of the pass as a central part of their structure. Passage to the act. Passage à l'acte. The phrase passage to the act comes from French clinical psychiatry, which uses it to designate those impulsive acts of a violent or criminal nature, which sometimes mark the onset of an acute psychotic episode. As the phrase itself indicates, these acts are supposed to mark the point when the subject proceeds from a violent idea or intention to the corresponding act, see La Planche and Pontaly. Because these acts are attributed to the action of the psychosis, French law absolves the perpetrator of civil responsibility for them. Che Mama, 1993-94. As psychoanalytic ideas gained wider circulation in France in the first half of the 20th century, it became common for French analysts to use the term passage à l'acte to translate the term agieren used by Freud, in other words, as a synonym for acting out. However, in his seminar of 1962-63, Lacan establishes a distinction between these terms. While both are last resorts against anxiety, the subject who acts something out still remains in the scene, whereas a passage to the act involves an exit from the scene altogether. Acting out is a symbolic message addressed to the big other, whereas a passage to the act is a flight from the big other into the dimension of the real. The passage to the act is thus an exit from the symbolic network, a dissolution of the social bond. Although the passage to the act does not, according to Lacan, necessarily imply an underlying psychosis, it does entail a dissolution of the subject. For a moment, the subject becomes a pure object. In order to illustrate what he means, Lacan refers to the case of the young homosexual woman treated by Freud. Freud reports that the young woman was walking in the street with the woman she loved when she was spotted by her father, who cast an angry glance at her. Immediately afterwards, she rushed off and threw herself over a wall down the side of a cutting onto a railway line. Lacan argues that the suicide attempt was a passage to the act. It was not a message addressed to anyone, since symbolization had become impossible for the young woman. Confronted with her father's desire, she was consumed with an uncontrollable anxiety and reacted in an impulsive way by identifying with the object. Thus she fell down. German, niederkommt, like the objet pitié, the leftover of signification. Paternal metaphor. Métaphore paternelle. When in 1956 Lacan first begins to discuss the tropes of metaphor and metonymy in detail, the example he takes to illustrate the structure of metaphor is a line from Victor Hugo's poem Booth Endormi. This poem retells the biblical story of Ruth and Boaz. While Ruth sleeps at his feet, Boaz dreams that a tree grows out of his stomach, a revelation that he is to be the founder of a race. In the line which Lacan quotes, his sheaf was neither miserly nor spiteful, the metaphoric substitution of sheaf for Boaz produces a poetic effect of signification. Paternity is thus both the theme of the poem, its content, and also inherent in the structure of metaphor itself. All paternity involves metaphoric substitution and vice versa. The phrase paternal metaphor is introduced by Lacan in 1957. In 1958, he goes on to elaborate the structure of this metaphor. It involves the substitution of one signifier for another. One signifier, the name of the father, for another, the desire of the mother. The paternal metaphor thus designates the metaphorical, in other words, substitutive character of the Oedipus complex itself. It is the fundamental metaphor on which all signification depends. For this reason, all signification is phallic. If the name of the father is foreclosed, in other words, in psychosis, there can be no paternal metaphor and hence no phallic signification. See the figure, above the bar, name of the father, below the bar, desire of the mother. Above the bar, desire of the mother, below the bar, signifier to the subject, towards name of the father, between brackets, above the bar, capital A, below the bar, above the bar, the big other, below the bar, the phallus. Perversion was defined by Freud as any form of sexual behavior which deviates from the norm of heterosexual genital intercourse. However, this definition is problematized by Freud's own notions of the polymorphous perversity of all human sexuality, which is characterized by the absence of any pre-given natural order. Lacan overcomes this impasse in Freudian theory by defining perversion not as a form of behavior, but as a clinical structure. What is perversion? it is not simply an aberration in relation to social criteria, an anomaly contrary to good morals. Although this register is not absent, nor is it an atypicality according to natural criteria, namely that it more or less derogates from the reproductive finality of the sexual union. It is something else in its very structure. The distinction between perverse acts and the perverse structure implies that while there are certain sexual acts which are closely associated with perverse structures, it is also possible that such acts may be engaged in by non-perverse subjects, and equally possible that a perverse subject may never actually engage in such acts. It also implies a universalist position. While social disapproval and the infraction of good morals may be what determines whether a particular act is perverse or not, this is not the essence of the perverse structure. A perverse structure remains perverse even when the acts associated with it are socially approved. Hence, Lacan regards homosexuality as a perversion even when practiced in ancient Greece, where it was widely tolerated. This is not because homosexuality or any other form of sexuality is naturally perverse. On the contrary, the perverse nature of homosexuality is entirely a question of this infringement of the normative requirements of the Oedipus complex. Thus, Lacan criticizes Freud for forgetting at times that the importance of heterosexuality in the Oedipal myth is a question of norms and not of nature. The analyst's neutrality forbids him from taking sides with these norms. Rather than defending such norms or attacking them, the analyst seeks merely to expose their incidence in the subject's history. There are two main ways in which Lacan characterizes the perverse structure: the phallus and disavowal. Perversion is distinguished from the other clinical structures by the operation of disavowal. The pervert disavows castration. He perceives that the mother lacks the phallus and at the same time refuses to accept the reality of this traumatic perception. This is most evident in fetishism, the perversion of perversions, where the fetish is a symbolic substitute for the mother's thus missing phallus. However, this problematic relation to the phallus is not exclusive to fetishism, but extends to all the perversions. The whole problem of the perversions consists in conceiving how the child, in his relation to the mother, identifies himself with the imaginary object of her desire, in other words, the phallus. This is why the pre-Oedipal imaginary triangle plays such an important role in the perverse structure. In the perversions, the phallus can only function as veiled. See Lacan's discussion of the role of the veil in fetishism, transvestism, homosexuality, and exhibitionism. The drive. Perversion is also a particular way in which the subject situates himself in relation to the drive. In perversion, the subject locates himself as the object of the drive and the means of the other's jouissance. This is to invert the structure of fantasy, which is why the formula for perversion appears as objet petit A in congruity with subject Bart. In the first schema in Kant with Sate, the inversion of the theme of fantasy. The pervert assumes the position of the object instrument of the will to enjoy, volonté de jouissance, which is not his own will but that of the big other. The pervert does not pursue his activity for his own pleasure but for the enjoyment of the big other. He finds enjoyment precisely in this instrumentalization, in working for the enjoyment of the big other. The subject here makes himself the instrument of the big other's jouissance. Thus in scopophilia, as spelled scoptophilia, which comprises exhibitionism and voyeurism, the pervert locates himself as the object of the scopic drive. In sadism, masochism, the subject locates himself as the object of the invocatory drive. The pervert is a person in whom the structure of the drive is most clearly revealed, and also the person who carries the attempt to go beyond the pleasure principle to the limit. He who goes as far as he can along the path of jouissance. Freud's remark that the neuroses are the negative of the perversions has sometimes been interpreted as meaning that perversion is simply the direct expression of a natural instinct which is repressed in neurosis. However, Lacan rejects this interpretation entirely. Firstly, the drive is not to be conceived of as a natural instinct which could be discharged in a direct way. It has no zero degree of satisfaction. Secondly, as is clear from the above remarks, the pervert's relation to the drive is just as complex and elaborated as that of the neurotic. From the point of view of genetic development, perversion is at the same level as neurosis. Both have reached the third time of the Oedipus complex. Perversion therefore presents the same dimensional richness as a neurosis, the same abundance, the same rhythms, the same stages. It is therefore necessary to interpret Freud's remark in another way. Perversion is structured in an inverse way to neurosis, but is equally structured. While neurosis is characterized by a question, perversion is characterized by the lack of a question. The pervert does not doubt that his act served the jouissance of the big other. Thus it is extremely rare for a perverse subject to demand analysis, and in the rare cases when he does, it is not because he seeks to change his mode of jouissance. This perhaps explains why many psychoanalysts have argued that psychoanalytic treatment is not appropriate for perverse subjects, a line which even some Lacanian analysts have taken, comparing the certainty of the pervert with that of the psychotic, and arguing that perverts cannot take the position of one who does not know before a subject supposed to know. Clavreul. However, most Lacanian analysts do not take this view, since it is a view completely at odds with Lacan's own position. In the seminar of 1956-57, for example, Lacan points to the dream of the young homosexual woman whom Freud treated as a clear manifestation of transference in a perverse subject. Also, in 1960-61 seminar, Lacan's principal example of transference is that shown by Alcibiades, whom he clearly regards as a pervert. See, Alcibiades is certainly not a neurotic. Thus Lacan argues that perverse subjects can be treated at the same level as neurotics, although there will of course be different problems in the direction of the treatment. One important implication of this is that the psychoanalytic treatment of a perverse subject does not set as its objective the elimination of his perverse behavior. Phallus. Freud's work abounds in reference to the penis. Freud argues that children of both sexes set great value on the penis, and that their discovery that some human beings do not possess a penis leads to important psychical consequences. See castration complex. However, the term phallus rarely appears in Freud's work, and when it does, it is used as a synonym for penis. Freud does use the adjective phallic more frequently, such as in the expression the phallic face, but again this implies no rigorous distinction between the terms phallus and penis, since the phallic face denotes a stage in development in which the child, boy or girl, knows only one genital organ, the penis. Lacan generally prefers to use the term phallus rather than penis in order to emphasize the fact that what concerns psychoanalytic theory is not the male genital organ in its biological reality, but the role that this organ plays in fantasy. Hence, Lacan usually reserves the term penis for the biological organ and the term phallus for the imaginary and symbolic functions of this organ. While this terminological distinction is not found in Freud's work, it responds to the logic implicit in Freud's formulations on the penis. For example, when Freud speaks of a symbolic equation between the penis and the baby, which allows the girl to appease her penis by envy by having a child, it is clear that he is not talking about a real organ. It can be argued then that Lacan's terminological innovation simply clarified certain distinctions that were already implicit in Freud's work. Although not prominent in Lacan's work before the mid-1950s, the term phallus occupies an ever more important place in his discourse thereafter. The phallus plays a central role in both the Oedipus complex and in the theory of sexual difference. The phallus and the Oedipus complex. The phallus is one of the three elements in the imaginary triangle that constitutes the pre-Oedipal phase. It is an imaginary object which circulates between the two other two elements, the mother and the child. The mother desires this object and the child seeks to satisfy her desire by identifying with the phallus or with the phallic mother. In the Oedipus complex, the father intervenes as a fourth term in this imaginary triangle by castrating the child. That is, he makes it impossible for the child to identify with the imaginary phallus. The child is then faced with the choice of accepting his castration, accepting that he cannot be the mother's phallus, or rejecting it. The phallus and sexual difference. Lacan argues that both boys and girls must assume their castration in the sense that every child must renounce the possibility of being the phallus for the mother. This relationship to the phallus is established without regard to the anatomical difference of the sexes. The renunciation by both sexes of identification with the imaginary phallus paves the way for a relationship with a symbolic phallus which is different for the sexes. The man has the symbolic phallus, or more precisely, he is not without having it. Il n'est pas sans l'avoir. But the woman does not. This is complicated by the fact that a man can only lay claim to the symbolic phallus on condition that he has assumed his own castration, has given up being the imaginary phallus, and by the fact that the woman's lack of the symbolic phallus is also a kind of possession. The status of the phallus, real, imaginary, or symbolic. Lacan speaks of the real phallus, the imaginary phallus, and the symbolic phallus. The real phallus. As has already been observed, Lacan usually uses the term penis to denote the real biological organ and reserves the term phallus to denote the imaginary and symbolic functions of this organ. However, he does not always maintain this usage, occasionally using the term real phallus to denote the biological organ, or using the terms symbolic phallus and symbolic penis, as if they were synonymous. This apparent confusion and semantic slippage has led some commentators to argue that the supposed distinction between the phallus and the penis is in fact highly unstable, and that the phallus concept is the site of a regression towards the biological organ. Macy. While the imaginary phallus and the symbolic phallus are discussed more extensively by Lacan than the real phallus, he does not entirely ignore the latter. On the contrary, the real penis has an important role to play in the Oedipus complex of the little boy, for it is precisely via this organ that his sexuality makes itself felt in infantile masturbation. This intrusion of the real in the imaginary pre-Oedipal triangle is what transforms the triangle from something pleasurable to something which provokes anxiety. The question posed in the Oedipus complex is that of where the real phallus is located. The answer required for the resolution of this complex is that it is located in the real father. The real phallus is written twice I, capital I, or like Roman 2, whatever they call it. The real phallus is written in Lacanian algebra. The imaginary phallus. When Lacan first introduces the distinction between penis and phallus, the phallus refers to an imaginary object. This is the image of the penis imagined as a part object which may be detached from the body by castration, the phallic image. The imaginary phallus is perceived by the child in the pre-Oedipal phase as the object of the mother's desire, as that which she desires beyond the child. The child thus seeks to identify with this object. The Oedipus complex and the castration complex involve the renunciation of this attempt to be the imaginary phallus. The imaginary phallus is written lowercase phi in Lacanian algebra, which also represents phallic signification. Castration is written minus lowercase phi. The symbolic phallus, the imaginary phallus which circulates between mother and child, serves to institute the first dialectic in the child's life, which, although it is an imaginary dialect, already paves the way towards the symbolic. Since an imaginary element is circulated in much the same way as a signifier, the phallus becomes an imaginary signifier. Thus Lacan's formulations on the imaginary phallus in the seminar of 1956-57 are accompanied by the statement that the phallus is also a symbolic object, and that the phallus is a signifier. The idea that the phallus is a signifier is taken up again and further developed in the 1957-58 seminar and becomes the principal element of Lacan's theory of the phallus thereafter. The phallus is described as the signifier of the desire of the big other and the signifier of jouissance. These arguments are stated in their most definitive form in Lacan's paper on the signification of the phallus. The phallus is not a fantasy, if by that we mean an imaginary effect, nor is it as such an object, part, internal, good, bad, etc. It is even less the organ, penis, or clitoris that it symbolizes. The phallus is a signifier. It is the signifier intended to designate as a whole the effects of the signified. Whereas the castration complex and the Oedipus complex revolve around the imaginary phallus, the question of sexual difference revolves around the symbolic phallus. The phallus has no corresponding female signifier. The phallus is a symbol to which there is no correspondent, no equivalent. It is a matter of dissymmetry in the signifier. Both male and female subjects assume their sex via the symbolic phallus. Unlike the imaginary phallus, the symbolic phallus cannot be negated, for on the symbolic plane, an absence is just as much a positive entity as a presence. Thus, even the woman who lacks the symbolic phallus in one way can also be said to possess it, since not having it, the symbolic is itself a form of having. Conversely, the assumption of the symbolic phallus by the man is only possible on the basis of the prior assumption of his own castration. Lacan goes on in 1961 to state that symbolic phallus is that which appears in the place of the lack of the signifier in the big other. It is no ordinary signifier, but the real presence of desire itself. In 1973, he states that the symbolic phallus is the signifier which does not have a signified. The symbolic phallus is written capital Phi in Lacanian algebra. However, Lacan warns his students that the complexity of this symbol might be missed if they simply identify it with the symbolic phallus. This symbol is more correctly understood as designating the phallic function. In the early 1970s, Lacan incorporates this symbol of the phallic function in his formulae of sexuation. Using predicate logic to articulate the problems of sexual difference, Lacan devises two formulae for the masculine position and two formulae for the feminine position. All four formulae revolve around the phallic function, which is here equivalent with the function of castration. Criticisms of Lacan. Of all Lacan's ideas, his concept of the phallus is perhaps the one which has given rise to most controversy. Objections to Lacan's concept fall into two main groups. Firstly, some feminist writers have argued that the privileged position Lacan accords to the phallus means that he merely repeats the patriarchal gestures of Freud, for example, Gross. Other feminists have defended Lacan, arguing that his distinction between the phallus and the penis provides a way of accounting for sexual difference which is irreducible to biology, for example, Mitchell and Rose. The second main objection to Lacan's concept of the phallus is that put forward by Jacques Derrida and echoed by others. Derrida argues that despite Lacan's protestations of anti-transcendentalism, the phallus operates as a transcendental element which acts as an ideal guarantee of meaning. How can there be such a thing as a privileged signifier, asks Derrida, given that every signifier is defined only by its differences from other signifiers? The phallus, in other words, reintroduces the metaphysics of presence, which Derrida denominates as logocentrism. And thus Derrida concludes that by articulating this with phallocentrism, Lacan has created a phallogocentric system of thought. Philosophy. Freud regarded philosophy as one of the great cultural institutions alongside art and religion, the mark of a highly developed state of civilization. However, he viewed the relationship between philosophy and psychoanalysis in ambiguous terms. On the one hand, he credited certain philosophers, such as Empedocles and Nietzsche, with having anticipated purely by intuition what psychoanalysts discovered only by laborious investigation. On the other hand, he repeatedly criticized philosophers for equating the psyche with consciousness and thus excluding the unconscious on a purely a priori grounds, and likened philosophical systems to paranoid delusions. In Lacan's work, too, there is an ambivalent relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy. On the one hand, Lacan opposes psychoanalysis to the totalizing explanations of philosophical systems, and links philosophy with the discourse of the master, the reverse of psychoanalysis. On the other hand, Lacan's work is full of philosophical references. Indeed, this is often regarded as one of the features that distinguishes Lacan from other psychoanalytic thinkers. The philosophers most frequently referred to by Lacan are the following. Plato. Lacan often compares the psychoanalytic method to the Socratic dialogue, see dialectic. He also refers specifically to a number of Plato's works, especially the Symposium, to which he dedicates a large part of his 1960-1961 seminar. Aristotle. Lacan discusses Aristotle's topology of causation in the 1964 seminar, see Chance, and Aristotelian logic in the seminars 1970-1971. Descartes. References to Descartes abound in Lacan's work since he sees the philosophy of the cogito as summing up the very heart of the psychology of modern man. The Lacanian concept of the subject is both the Cartesian subject in its quest to move from doubt to certainty and the subversion of the Cartesian subject. Kant. It is Kant's moral philosophy, the critique of practical reason, which most interests Lacan, and he discusses this at length both in his seminar on ethics 1959-60 and his essay on Kant with Sate. Lacan uses Kant's categorical imperative to throw light on the Freudian concept of the superego. Hegel. Lacan attended a series of lectures on Hegel given by Alexandre Kojève in 1933-39 at the École des Hautes Études. These lectures were later collected and published by Raymond Queneau. The influence of these lectures on his work, especially his earlier work, is immense, and whenever Lacan refers to Hegel, it is Kojève's reading of Hegel that he has in mind. From Hegel, Lacan takes, among other things, an emphasis on dialectical modes of thought, the concept of the beautiful soul, the dialectic of the master and the slave, and a distinction between animal and human desire. Heidegger established a personal Lacan established a personal friendship with Heidegger, visiting him and translating some of his works. Heidegger's influence on Lacan's work can be seen in Lacan's metaphysical discussions of being, and in the distinction between full speech and empty speech. These are only the philosophers to whom Lacan refers most frequently. He also discusses the work of many other philosophers such as Saint Augustine, Spinoza, Sartre, and others. Lacan's work engages with many philosophical schools and areas of enquiry. In his early work, he shows a bent towards phenomenology, even presenting a phenomenological description of the psychoanalytic experience in 1936, but he later becomes quite opposed to phenomenology, and in 1964 presents a critique of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception. Insofar as psychoanalysis engages with ontological questions, Lacan aligns psychoanalysis with materialism, against all forms of idealism. Lacan also engages with epistemology and the philosophy of science, whereas his constant approach is rationalist rather than empiricist. Further information on Lacan's relationship with philosophy is provided in Jourdainville, Macy, Raglan Sullivan, and Samuels. Phobie. A phobia is usually defined in psychiatry as an extreme fear of a particular object, such as an animal, or a particular situation, such as leaving the home. Those who suffer from a phobia experience anxiety if they encounter the phobic object or are placed in the feared situation, and develop the avoidance strategies so as to prevent this from happening. These avoidance strategies may become so elaborate that the subject's life is severely restricted. Freud's most important contribution to the study of phobias concerned a young boy whom he dubbed Little Hans. Shortly before his 5th birthday, Hans developed a violent fear of horses and became unwilling to go outdoors lest he encounter one in the street. In his case study of Hans, Freud distinguished between the initial onset of anxiety, which was not attached to any object, and the ensuing fear, which was focused specifically on horses. Only the latter constituted the phobia proper. Freud argued that the anxiety was the transformation of sexual excitement generated in Hans by his relationship with his mother, and that the horses represented his father, who Hans feared would punish him. Lacan, in his seminar of 1956-57, offers a detailed reading of the case of Little Hans and proposes his own view of phobia. Following Freud, he stresses the difference between phobia and anxiety. Anxiety appears first, and the phobia is a defensive formation which turns the anxiety into fear by focusing it on a specific object. However, rather than identifying the phobic object as a representative of the father, as Freud does, Lacan argues that the fundamental characteristic of the phobic object is that it does not simply represent one person, but represents different people in turn. Lacan points out the extremely diverse ways in which Hans describes the feared horse at different moments of his phobia. For example, at one point Hans is afraid that a horse will bite him, and at another moment that a horse will fall down. At each of these different moments, Lacan argues the horse represents a different person in Hans's life. The horse thus functions not as the equivalent of a soul signified, but as a signifier which has no univocal sense and is displaced onto different signifieds in turn. Lacan argues that Hans develops the horse phobia because his real father fails to intervene as the agent of castration, which is his proper role in the Oedipus complex. When his sexuality begins to make itself felt in infantile masturbation, the preoedipal triangle mother-child imaginary phallus is transformed from being Hans's source of enjoyment into something that provokes anxiety in him. The intervention of the real father would have saved Hans from this anxiety by symbolically castrating him, but in the absence of this intervention, Hans is forced to find a substitute in the phobia. The phobia functions by using an imaginary object, a horse, to reorganize the symbolic world of Hans and thus help him to make the passage from the imaginary to the symbolic order. Far from being a purely negative phenomenon, then a phobia makes a traumatic situation thinkable, livable, by introducing a symbolic dimension even if it is only a provisional solution. The phobic object is thus an imaginary element which is able to function as a signifier by being used to represent every possible element in the subject's world. For Hans, the horse represents at different moments his father, his mother, his little sister, his friends, himself, and many other things besides. In the process of developing all the permutations possible around the signifying crystal of his phobia, little Hans was able to exhaust all the possibilities that blocked his passage from the imaginary to the symbolic, and thus find a solution to the impossible by recourse to a signifying equation. In other words, a phobia plays exactly the same role which Claude Lévi-Strauss assigns to myths, only on the level of the individual rather than of society. What is important in the myth, argues Lévi-Strauss, is not any natural or archetypal meaning of the isolated elements which make it up, but the way they are combined and recombined in such a way that while the elements change position, the relations between the positions are immutable. This repeated recombination of the same elements allows an impossible situation to be faced up to by articulating in turn all the different forms of its impossibility. What are the practical consequences of Lacan's theory in the treatment of subjects who suffer phobias? Who suffer from phobias. Rather than simply desensitizing the subject as in behavioral therapy, or simply providing an explanation of the phobic object, for example, the horse is your father, the treatment should aim at helping the subject to work through all the various permutations involving the phobic signifier. By helping the subject to develop the individual mything in accordance with its own laws, the treatment enables him finally to exhaust all the possible combinations of signifying elements and thus to dissolve the phobia. It should be borne in mind that Lacan's discussion of the case of little Hans only explicitly addresses the question of childhood phobias and leaves open the question of whether these remarks also apply to adult phobias. As Freud himself noted in his case study of little Hans, phobias had not previously been assigned any definite position in psychiatric nosographies. He attempted to remedy this uncertainty surrounding the classification of phobia, but his proposed solution is prey to a certain ambiguity. On the one hand, since phobic symptoms can be found among both neurotic and psychotic subjects, Freud argued that phobias could not be regarded as an independent pathological process. On the other hand, in the same work, Freud did isolate a particular form of neurosis whose central symptom is a phobia. Freud called this new diagnostic category anxiety hysteria in order to distinguish it from conversion hysteria, which Freud had previously referred to simply as hysteria. Freud's remarks are thus ambiguous, implying that phobia can be both a symptom and an underlying clinical entity. The same ambiguity is repeated in Lacan's works, where the question is rephrased in terms of whether phobia is a symptom or a structure. Usually, Lacan distinguishes only two neurotic structures, hysteria and obsessional neurosis, and describes phobia as a symptom rather than a structure. However, there are also points in Lacan's work where he lists phobia as a third form of neurosis, in addition to hysteria and obsessional neurosis, thus implying that there is a phobic structure. In 1961, for example, he describes phobia as the most radical form of neurosis. The question is not resolved until the seminar of 1968-69, where Lacan states that one cannot see in it, phobia, a clinical entity, but rather a revolving junction, plaque tournante, something that must be elucidated in its relations with that towards which it usually tends, namely the two great orders of neurosis, hysteria and obsessionality, and also the junction which it realizes with perversion. From Lacan, quoted in Che Mama. Thus, phobia is not, according to Lacan, a clinical structure on the same level as hysteria and obsessional neurosis, but a gateway which can lead to either of them and which also has certain connections with the perverse structure. The link with perversion can be seen in the similarities between the fetish and the phobic object, both of which are symbolic substitutes for a missing element and both of which serve to structure the surrounding world. Furthermore, both phobia and perversion arise from difficulties in the passage from the imaginary pre-Oedipal triangle to the symbolic Oedipal quaternary. Pleasure principle. Principe de plaisir. Even when Lacan uses the word pleasure on its own, he is always referring to the pleasure principle and never to a sensation. The pleasure principle is one of the two principles of mental functioning posited by Freud in his metapsychological writings, the other being the reality principle. The pleasure principle aims exclusively at avoiding unpleasure and obtaining pleasure. Lacan's first extended discussion of the pleasure principle appears in the seminars of 1954-55. Here Lacan compares the pleasure principle to a homeostatic device that aims at maintaining excitation at the lowest functional level. This accords with Freud's thesis that unpleasure is related to the increase of quantities of excitation and pleasure to their reduction. Lacan opposes the pleasure principle, which he dubs the restitutive tendency, to the death drive, the repetitive tendency, in accordance with Freud's view that the death drive is beyond the pleasure principle. In 1960, Lacan develops what soon comes to be an important concept in his work, the idea of an opposition between pleasure and jouissance. Jouissance is now defined as an excessive quantity of excitation which the pleasure principle attempts to prevent. The pleasure principle is thus seen as a symbolic law, a commandment which can be phrased enjoy as little as possible, which is why Freud originally called it the unpleasure principle. Pleasure is the safeguard of a state of homeostasis and constancy with which jouissance constantly threatens to disrupt and traumatize. The function of the pleasure principle is, in effect, to lead the subject from signifier to signifier by generating as many signifiers as are required to maintain at as low a level as possible the tension that regulates the whole functioning of the psychic apparatus. Put another way, the pleasure principle is the prohibition of incest, that which regulates the distance between the subject and das Ding, see thing. When the subject transgresses this prohibition, gets too near to the thing, then he suffers, since it is the drives which permit the subject to transgress the pleasure principle. It follows that every drive is a death drive. Since the pleasure principle is related to prohibition, to the law, and to regulation, it is clearly on the side of the symbolic, whereas jouissance is on the side of the real. The pleasure principle is thus nothing else than the dominance of the signifier. This involves Lacan in a paradox, since the symbolic is also the realm of the repetition compulsion, which is, in Freud's terms, precisely that which goes beyond the pleasure principle. Indeed, some of Lacan's descriptions of the pleasure principle make it sound almost identical to the repetition compulsion. The function of the pleasure principle is to make man always search for what he has to find again, but which he will never attain. Point de Capiton. The French term point de capiton is variously translated in English editions of Lacan's work as quilting point or anchoring point. To avoid the confusion resulting from this variety of translation, the term has here been left in the original French. It literally designates an upholstery button. The analogy being that just as upholstery buttons are places where the mattress maker's needle has worked hard to prevent a shapeless mass of stuffing from moving too freely about. Bowie. So the points de capiton are points at which signified and signifier are knotted together. Lacan introduces the term in his 1955-56 seminar on the psychoses to account for the fact that despite the continual slippage of the signified under the signifier, see slip, there are nevertheless in the normal neurotic subject certain fundamental attachment points between the signified and the signifier where this slippage is temporarily halted. A certain minimum number of these points are necessary for a person to be called normal, and when they are not established or when they give way, the result is psychosis. This helps to explain how it is that in the psychotic experience, the signifier and the signified present themselves in a completely divided form. The point de capiton is thus the point in the signifying chain at which the signifier stops the otherwise endless movement of the signification and produces the necessary illusion of a fixed meaning. Since the signifying chain has both a diachronic and a synchronic dimension, so also does the point de capiton. 1. The diachronic dimension of the point de capiton lies in the fact that communication is always a retroactive effect of punctuation. It is only when the sentence is completed that the sense of the first words is determined retroactively. This function is illustrated in the elementary cell of the graph of desire, in which the point de capiton is the leftmost point of intersection between the vector S to S accent and the vector triangle or delta to subject Bart. 2. The synchronic aspect is metaphor, by which the signifier crosses the bar into the signified. The synchronic structure of the point de capiton is more hidden, and it is this structure that takes us to the source. It is metaphor. Pre-Oedipal phase. Stade pre-Oedipien. The pre-Oedipal phase is the period of psychosexual development prior to the formation of the Oedipus complex. The term emerges very late in Freud's work in the context of his discussion of female sexuality. Before Lacan, the pre-Oedipal phase was usually represented as a dual relation between mother and child, existing prior to any third term which could mediate it. However, Lacan argues that such an approach has the disadvantage of rendering the concept unthinkable in psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalysis deals exclusively with structure, which requires a minimum of 3 terms, and thus a pre-Oedipal phase which is represented as a purely dual relation cannot be conceived of in analytic terms. The child is never completely alone with the mother, since there is always a third term. Hence, when Lacan speaks of a pre-Oedipal phase, he presents it not as a dual relation, but as a triangle. The third element in the pre-Oedipal triangle, which mediates the dual relation between the mother and the child, is the phallus, an imaginary object which circulates between them in a series of exchanges. In the Seaman Seminar of 1957-58, Lacan speaks of this imaginary triangle not as a pre-Oedipal phase, but as the first time of the Oedipus complex. Whether described as pre-Oedipal or as a moment in the Oedipus complex itself, the imaginary triangle of the mother, child, and phallus arises when the infant perceives a lack in the mother. The infant realizes that the mother is not completely satisfied with him alone, but desires something else, the phallus. The child then seeks to be the phallus for the mother, which involves him in a seductive game of lures, in which the child is never really there at the place where he is, and is never completely absent from the place where he is not. In the seminar of 1956-57, where Lacan analyzes the case of little Hans, he shows how, for a while, this game is satisfying for Hans, and argues that there is nothing inherent in it that would put an end to this pre-Oedipal paradise. However, at some point, something else intervenes which introduces a discordant note of anxiety into the game. This something else is the first stirring of the drive, which manifests itself in infantile masturbation. The intervention of the real organ in this way transforms the imaginary triangle into a deadly game, an impossible task in which the child is completely prey to the arbitrary desire of the omnipotent devouring mother. The child is only saved from this deadly game by the intervention of the father as a fourth term, the father who rightfully claims possession of the phallus on the basis of a symbolic law. The interest of the pre-Oedipal phase for Lacan does not only lie in its function in paving the way for the Oedipus complex, but also in the fact that all the perversions have their origin in this phase. Perversion always involves some kind of identification with another term in the pre-Oedipal triangle, whether it be the mother or the imaginary phallus, or both, as in fetishism. Privation. Privation. In his seminar of 1956-57, Lacan distinguishes between three types of lack of objects: privation, frustration, and castration. See lack. Each of these types of lack is located in a different order, each is brought about by a different kind of agent, and each involves a different kind of object. Privation is defined as a lack in the real of a symbolic object, the symbolic phallus. The agent who brings about this lack is the imaginary father. Privation is Lacan's attempt to theorize more rigorously Freud's concept of female castration and penis envy. According to Freud, when children realize that some women do not have a penis, this is a traumatic moment which produces different effects in the boy and in the girl. See castration complex. Whereas the boy develops a fear of having his penis cut off, the girl envies the boy his possession of the penis, which she sees as a highly desirable organ. The girl blames the mother for depriving her of a penis and redirects her affections to the father in the hope that he will provide her with a child as a symbolic substitute for the penis she lacks. Privation then refers to the female's lack of a penis, which is clearly a lack in the real. However, by definition, the real is full. The real is never lacking in itself, and thus the notion of privation implies the symbolization of the object in the real. In other words, when the child perceives the penis, a real organ, as absent, it is only because he has a notion that it somehow should be there, which is to introduce the symbolic into the real. Thus, what is lacking is not a real organ, for biologically speaking, the vagina is not incomplete without one. What is lacking is a symbolic object, the symbolic phallus. Its symbolic nature is confirmed by the fact that it can be substituted by a child in the girl's unconscious, in appeasing her penis envy by desiring a child. Freud argues the girl slips along the lines of a symbolic equation, one might say from the penis to a baby. Freud argues that the little girl blames her mother for depriving her of a penis. Lacan, however, argues that it is the imaginary father who is held to be the agent of privation. However, these two accounts are not necessarily incompatible, even though the girl may at first resent the mother for depriving her of a penis and turn to the father in the hope that he will provide her with a symbolic substitute. She later turns her resentment against the father when he fails to provide her with the desired child. Freud argues that penis envy persists into adulthood, manifesting itself both in the desire to enjoy the penis in sexual intercourse and in the desire to have a child. Since the father has failed to provide her with a child, the woman turns to another man instead. Lacan argues that even when the woman has a child, this does not spell the end of her sense of privation. Her desire for the phallus remains unsatisfied no matter how many children she has. The mother's basic dissatisfaction is perceived by the child from very early on. He realizes that she has a desire that aims at something beyond her relationship with him, the imaginary phallus. The child then seeks to fulfill her desire by identifying with the imaginary phallus. In this way, the privation of the mother is responsible for introducing the dialectic of desire in the child's life for the first time. Progress. Lacan claims that the idea of progress, like other humanist concepts, is alien to his teaching. There is not the slightest idea of progress in anything I articulate, in the sense that this term would imply a happy solution. In this respect, Lacan is a basically pessimistic thinker, and he finds support for such pessimism in the gloomier works of Freud, such as Civilization and Its Discontents. These texts allow Lacan to argue that Freud was in no way a progressive. Lacan rejects the idea of progress because it is based on a linear unidirectional concept of time, and also because it implies the possibility of synthetic dialectic. Along with the idea of progress, Lacan rejects other related concepts such as that of a unilinear sequence of phases of psychosexual development. There is one sense, however, in which Lacan does speak of progress, the progress in psychoanalytic treatment, insofar as treatment is a process which has a beginning and an end, when this treatment is moving and not stuck. We may speak of progress. The treatment is progressing as long as new material is emerging. Indeed, psychoanalytic treatment may be described as a progress towards truth. Projection is a defense mechanism in which an internal desire thought feeling is displaced and located outside the subject in another subject. For example, a person who has been or who feels unfaithful to his partner may defend himself against feelings of guilt by accusing the partner of being unfaithful. Whereas Freud and many other psychoanalysts use the term projection to describe a mechanism which is present to different degrees in both psychosis and neurosis, Lacan understands the term projection as a purely neurotic mechanism and distinguishes it clearly from the apparently similar phenomenon that occurs in psychosis, which Lacan calls foreclosure. Whereas projection is rooted in the imaginary dual relationship between the ego and the counterpart. Foreclosure goes beyond the imaginary and instead involves a signifier which is not incorporated in the symbolic. Lacan also rejects the view that introjection is the inverse of projection, arguing that these two processes are located on quite different levels. Whereas projection is an imaginary mechanism, introjection is a symbolic process. Psychoanalysis, psychanalyse. Psychoanalysis is a theory and practice initiated by Sigmund Freud in 1856 till 1939, founded on the discovery of the unconscious. Freud distinguishes between psychoanalysis as 1. A method for investigating unconscious mental processes, 2. A method for treating neurotic disorders, and 3. A set of theories about the mental processes revealed by the psychoanalytic method of investigation and treatment. The word psychoanalysis on its own is therefore ambiguous, since it can refer to psychoanalysis as a practice or to psychoanalysis as a theory or to both. In this dictionary, when it is necessary to avoid this ambiguity, the term psychoanalytic treatment is used to refer to psychoanalysis as a practice, and the term psychoanalytic theory is used to refer to psychoanalysis as a body of thought. Lacan trained initially as a psychiatrist and turned to psychoanalysis to help him with his psychiatric research. This then led Lacan to train as a psychoanalyst himself in the 1930s. From then on until his death in 1981, he dedicated himself to practicing as an analyst and developing psychoanalytic theory. In the process, Lacan constructed a highly original way of discussing psychoanalysis, which both reflected and determined an original way of conducting the treatment. In this sense, it is thus possible to speak of a specifically Lacanian form of psychoanalytic treatment. However, Lacan never admits that he has created a distinctive Lacanian form of psychoanalysis. On the contrary, when he describes his own approach to psychoanalysis, he speaks only of psychoanalysis, thus implying that his own approach is the only authentic form of psychoanalysis, the only one which is truly in line with Freud's approach. Thus, the three major non-Lacanian schools of psychoanalytic theory, Kleinian psychoanalysis, ego psychology, object relations theory, are all, in Lacan's views, deviations from authentic psychoanalysis whose errors his own return to Freud is designed to correct. See Freud, Return to. From the beginning, Lacan argues that psychoanalytic theory is a scientific rather than a religious mode of discourse, see Science, with a specific object, attempts to apply concepts developed in psychoanalytic theory to other objects, cannot claim to be doing applied psychoanalysis, since psychoanalytic theory is not a general master discourse but a theory of a specific situation. Psychoanalysis is an autonomous discipline. It may borrow concepts from many other disciplines, but this does not mean that it is dependent on any of them, since it reworks these concepts in a unique way. Thus, psychoanalysis is not a branch of psychology, nor of medicine, nor of philosophy, nor of linguistics, and it is certainly not a form of psychotherapy, since its aim is not to cure, but to articulate truth. Psychology. In his pre-1950 writings, Lacan sees psychoanalysis and psychology as parallel disciplines which can cross-fertilize each other. Although he is very critical of the conceptual inadequacies of associationist psychology, Lacan argues that psychoanalysis can help to build an authentic psychology free from such errors by providing it with truly scientific concepts such as the imago and the complex. However, from 1950 on, there is a gradual but constant tendency to dissociate psychoanalysis from psychology. Lacan begins by arguing that psychology is confined to an understanding of animal psychology, ethology. The psychological is, if we try to grasp it as firmly as possible, the ethological, that is the whole of the biological individual's behavior in relation to his natural environment. This is not to say that it cannot say anything about human beings, for humans are also animals, but that it cannot say anything about that which is uniquely human, although at one point Lacan does state that the theory of the ego and of narcissism extend modern ethological research. Thus psychology is reduced to general laws of behavior which apply to all animals, including human beings. Lacan rejects the doctrine of a discontinuity between animal psychology and human psychology, which is far away from our thought. However, Lacan vigorously rejects the behaviorist theory according to which the same general laws of behavior are sufficient to explain all human psychic phenomena. Only psychoanalysis, which uncovers the linguistic basis of human subjectivity, is adequate to explain those psychic phenomena which are specifically human. In the 1960s, the distance between psychoanalysis and psychology is emphasized further in Lacan's work. Lacan argues that psychology is essentially a tool of technocratic exploitation, and that it is dominated by the illusions of wholeness and synthesis, nature and instinct, autonomy and self-consciousness. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, subverts these illusions cherished by psychology, and in this sense the Freudian enunciation has nothing to do with psychology. For example, the most cherished illusion of psychology is the unity of the subject, and psychoanalysis subverts this notion by demonstrating that the subject is irremediably split or barred. Psychose. The term psychosis arose in psychiatry in the 19th century as a way of designating mental illness in general. During Freud's life, a basic distinction between psychosis and neurosis came to be generally accepted, according to which psychosis designated extreme forms of mental illness and neurosis denoted less serious disorders. This basic distinction between neurosis and psychosis was taken up and developed by Freud himself in several papers. Lacan's interest in psychosis predates his interest in psychoanalysis. Indeed, it was his doctoral research, which concerned a psychotic woman whom Lacan calls Aimée, that first led Lacan to psychoanalytic theory. It has often been remarked that Lacan's depth to this patient is reminiscent of Freud's depth to his first neurotic patients, who were also female. In other words, whereas Freud's first approach to the unconscious is by way of neurosis, Lacan's first approach is via psychosis. It has also been common to compare Lacan's tortured and at times almost incomprehensible style of writing and speaking to the discourse of psychotic patients. Whatever one makes of such comparisons, it is clear that Lacan's discussions of psychosis are among the most significant and original aspects of his work. Lacan's most detailed discussion of psychosis appears in his seminar of 1955-56 entitled simply The Psychoses. It is here that he expounds what come to be the main tenets of the Lacanian approach to madness. Psychosis is defined as one of the three clinical structures, one of which is defined by the operation of foreclosure. In this operation, the name of the father is not integrated in the symbolic universe of the psychotic, it is foreclosed, with the result that a hole is left in the symbolic order. To speak of a hole in the symbolic order is not to say that the psychotic does not have an unconscious. On the contrary, in psychosis, the unconscious is present but not functioning. The psychotic structure thus results from a certain malfunction of the Oedipus complex, a lack in the paternal function. More specifically, in psychosis, the paternal function is reduced to the image of the father. The symbolic is reduced to the imaginary. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, it is important to distinguish between psychosis, which is a clinical structure, and psychotic phenomena, such as delusions and hallucinations. Two conditions are required for psychotic phenomena to emerge. The subject must have a psychotic structure, and the name of the father must be called into symbolic opposition to the subject. In the absence of the first condition, no confrontation with the paternal signifier will ever lead to psychotic phenomena. A neurotic can never become psychotic. In the absence of the second condition, the psychotic structure will remain latent. It is thus conceivable that a subject may have a psychotic structure and yet never develop delusions or experience hallucinations. When both conditions are fulfilled, the psychosis is triggered off. The latent psychosis becomes manifest in hallucinations and or delusions. Lacan bases his arguments on a detailed reading of the Schreber case. Daniel Paul Schreber was an appeal court judge in Dresden who wrote an account of his paranoid delusions. An analysis of these writings constitutes Freud's most important contribution to the study of psychosis. Lacan argues that Schreber's psychosis was triggered off by both his failure to produce a child and his election to an important position in the judiciary. Both of these experiences confronted him with the question of paternity in the real, and thus called the name of the father into symbolic opposition with the subject. In the 1970s, Lacan reformulates his approach to psychosis around the notion of the Borromean knot. The three rings in the knot represent the three orders, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. While in neurosis, these three rings are linked together in a particular way, in psychosis they become disentangled. Their psychotic dissociation may sometimes, however, be avoided by a symptomatic formation which acts as a fourth ring holding the other three together. See symptom. Lacan follows Freud in arguing that while psychosis is of great interest for psychoanalytic theory, it is outside the field of the classical method of psychoanalytic treatment, which is only appropriate for neurosis. To use the technique that Freud established outside the experience to which it was applied, in other words, neurosis, it is as stupid as to toil at the oars when the ship is on the sand. Not only is the classical method of psychoanalytic treatment inappropriate for psychotic subjects, but it is even contraindicated. For example, Lacan points out that the technique of psychoanalysis, which involves the use of the couch and free association, can easily trigger off a latent psychosis. This is the reason why Lacanian analysts usually follow Freud's recommendation to begin the treatment of a new patient with a series of face-to-face interviews. Only when the analyst is reasonably sure that the patient is not psychotic will the patient be asked to lie down on the couch and free associate. This does not mean that Lacanian analysts do not work with psychotic patients. On the contrary, much work has been done by Lacanian analysts in the treatment of psychosis. However, the method of treatment differs substantially from that used with neurotics and perverse patients. Lacan himself worked with psychotic patients but left very few comments on the technique he employed. Rather than setting out a technical procedure for working with psychosis, he limited himself to discussing the questions preliminary to any such work. Lacan rejects the approach of those who limit their analysis of psychosis to the imaginary order. Nothing is to be expected from the way psychosis is explored at the level of the imaginary, since the imaginary mechanism is what gives psychotic alienation its form, but not its dynamics. It is only by focusing on the symbolic order that Lacan is able to point to the fundamental determining element of psychosis, namely the hole in the symbolic order caused by foreclosure and the consequent imprisonment of the psychotic subject in the imaginary. It is also this emphasis on the symbolic order which leads Lacan to value above all the linguistic phenomena in psychosis. The importance given to language phenomena in psychosis is for us the most fruitful lesson of all. The language phenomena most notable in psychosis are disorders of language. And Lacan argues that the presence of such disorders is a necessary condition for diagnosis of psychosis. Among the psychotic language disorders which Lacan draws attention to are hollow phrases and the extensive use of neologisms, which may be completely new words coined by the psychotic, or already existing words which the psychotic redefines. In 1956, Lacan attributes these language disorders to the psychotic's lack of a sufficient number of points de capiton. The lack of sufficient points de capiton means that the psychotic experience is characterized by a constant slippage of the signified under the signifier, which is a disaster for signification. There is a continual cascade of reshapings of the signifier from which the increasing disaster of the imaginary proceeds until the level is reached at which signifier and signified are stabilized in the delusional metaphor. Another way of describing this is a relationship between the subject and the signifier in its most formal dimension, in its dimension as a pure signifier. This relationship of the subject to the signifier in its purely formal aspect constitutes the nucleus of psychosis. If the neurotic inhabits language, the psychotic is inhabited, possessed by language. Of all the various forms of psychosis, it is paranoia that most interests Lacan, while schizophrenia and manic depressive psychosis are rarely discussed. Lacan follows Freud in maintaining a structural distinction between paranoia and schizophrenia. Punctuation, ponctuation. To punctuate a signifying chain is to produce meaning. Before punctuation, there is simply a chain of discourse. It is the listener-receiver who punctuates this discourse and thereby sanctions retroactively one particular meaning of an utterance. The punctuation of the signifying chain is that which creates the illusion of a fixed meaning. The punctuation, once inserted, fixes the meaning. See point de capiton. This is essential in the structure of communication, where the sender receives his own message from the receiver, and is illustrated in the elementary cell of the graph of desire. The operation of punctuation may be illustrated by reference to two situations which are of fundamental importance to psychoanalysis: the mother-child relation and the relation between analysant and analyst. In the first of these situations, the baby who has not yet acquired speech can only articulate his needs in a very primitive kind of demand, namely by screaming. There is no way of knowing for sure whether a scream articulates hunger, pain, tiredness, fear, or something else, and yet the mother interprets it in one particular way, thus determining its meaning retroactively. Punctuation is one of the forms which the intervention of the analyst may take. By punctuating the analysant's discourse in an unexpected way, the analyst can retroactively alter the intended meaning of the analysant's speech. Changing the punctuation renews or upsets the fixed meaning that the analysant had attributed to his own speech. Such punctuation is a way of showing the subject that he is saying more than he thinks he is. The analyst can punctuate the analysant's discourse simply by repeating part of the analysant's speech back to him, perhaps with a different intonation or in a different context. For example, if the analysant says, "Tu es ma mère," you are my mother, the analyst may repeat it in such a way as to bring out the homophony of this phrase with "tu es ma mère," to kill my mother. Alternatively, the analyst can also punctuate the analysant's speech by a moment of silence, or by interrupting the analysant, or by terminating the session at an opportune moment. This last form of punctuation has been a source of controversy throughout the history of a Lacanian psychoanalysis, since it contravenes the traditional IPA practice of sessions of a fixed duration. Lacan's practice of sessions of variable durations, French séances scandées, wrongly dubbed short sessions by his critics, came to be one of the main reasons that the IPA gave for excluding him when the SFP was negotiating for IPA recognition in the early 1960s. Today, the technique of punctuation, especially as expressed in the practice of sessions of variable duration, continues to be a distinctive feature of Lacanian psychoanalysis.